everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day, and we have a special Canadian edition of Buy Day Friday. And I am joined today by our very good friends, Sherry and Steve Fieser from Robinson's Fine Prints. And if you haven't made it down to Robinson's in the Midtown Scholar recently, you're going to have to go. But Sherry and Steve accompanied us, Cathy, did they not?
Yes.
On our Canadian adventure, we went to the Stratford Festival and saw some Shakespeare, and we have now come down to Niagara-on-the-Lake. And in honor of these wonderful plays we're seeing, I have some special books. But before we do that, if you pan that way, Cathy, and show folks, you're going to see a gazebo, which looks rather gazebo-like. It was in the Stephen King, David Cronenberg movie, The Dead Zone. And it was in that very gazebo that Christopher Walken watches a murder take place. Can you believe that? Christopher Walken, an American actor, actually starred as Romeo at the Stratford Festival in 1968. And we just saw Romeo and Juliet, and now it's all Canadian actors, pretty much. But in the old days, the American actors could slip right in. Well, we have 50 years of celebrating Stephen King. It was our biggest event at this year's book festival, was the authors talking about the influence of Stephen King. And I just found a first edition Dead Zone, which I didn't bring with us, but at the Middletown Library sale just last week in Pennsylvania. It's pretty neat. And Stephen King is as hot as ever. Also, Christopher Walken's house is just down that way. But as I say, we were up at the Stratford Festival. We got a chance to see, among other things, Shakespeare. Cathy and I had seen two other Shakespeares. We saw Cymbeline and Twelfth Night, but with you all, we saw Romeo and Juliet. And wasn't it wonderful?
It was indeed.
Absolutely.
The one tragedy we saw among three other wonderful performances.
Yes. Yeah, I think we all know how Romeo and Juliet ends, which we weren't able to change, but it was a wonderful cast. It was a great show, and it inspired me to bring along a Shakespearean book today. And our first book, and I don't have a box. I know, it's tough, but I do have this bag. Our first book is a series of woodblock prints of the play Hamlet, which we saw last year at Stratford. And as you can see, it is block prints by DNS. Beautiful. And we'll show you who DNS is, because if you open the book up right here, you can see DNS is Dorothy N. Stewart. And Dorothy Stewart was a woodblock artist who was born in Pennsylvania to a wealthy family, but eventually moved out to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and really worked for the WPA during murals. You can see examples of that design.
Particularly interesting about this book is it's the first.
Yeah, let's turn to that. You can see that up in the beginning of the book, right where we started. It is copy number 1 of the first edition, printed by hand. Now, that's an interesting point. I said she was from a wealthy Philadelphia family, studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, but starting in about the 1920s, Dorothy went out to New Mexico and never returned. Was one of the early pioneering, one of many artists who went out west, maybe in like the George O'Keeffe tradition or other traditions, and found sort of freedom and the ability to just be incredibly creative. And then working for the WPA, did a series of murals. Her work is well represented in institutions, but since this was only 100 copies, this book is very, very rare. And it just walked into the Midtown Scholar last week. I'm not making that up. And my only guess is that she sent number 1 back to her family, because the couple copies that exist in institutions, including one at Princeton, were all to friends of the artist. And maybe that's how it ended up back in Pennsylvania. I thought, Steve, you could just talk a little bit about what makes a book like this special, and just how you create a book like this. I don't even know, but apparently you carve it directly into blocks of wood and then make a series of impressions. Is that fair?
Yes. Woodblock printing is like potato prints that children make in school. It's a relief print, so what's raised is what gets inked. What's cut away is what does not receive ink. And we've looked at some of these pages and found up to at least seven different colors.
Wow.
Within, you know, the images, and that could mean 7 completely different passes through the press, or some of the pieces could be
See all the
inked.
colors, yeah.
You know, just that piece would be ink blue and just a piece ink brown. But when they're overprinted, that demands a separate pass through the press. So very, very complicated technique. We think of
Flip through a little bit.
printmaking
Keep talking.
as an art in which
Wow.
a printed art in which the art does not exist. The artwork does not exist until it's printed. Prior to what you see, there is no original. There are pieces, there are elements, there are processes, but the artwork only appears upon printing. And that's the difference between an original print and a reproduction. So these are all original prints, and
So
the book
neat.
itself is a very elaborate production of printmaking.
And you can see
With
it.
even the borders.
There is essentially a proof sheet in the back.
Oh, neat.
What do we make of this?
Yes, maybe one of the sheets that didn't make it into the book, or an experimental proof sheet.
Yeah.
The paper feels like fabric. It's very
This
soft.
is fabric, I think. Yeah.
Possibly Japanese. It is completely new to me, the feel of this.
Interesting.
Last year we saw Hamlet at Stratford, and it was the first time ever with a non-white female actor, and it was incredible. It was absolutely amazing, and highly recommend it. And Juliet was equally as good. So if you have a chance to still make it up to Canada for some amazing Shakespeare, please do. Please come up and visit Stratford. Now, we are now at Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is, of course, the home of the Shaw Festival. So it is, I think, appropriate to also share one book related to George Bernard Shaw.
Excellent.
And I have to say, this one also walked in as a very interesting association book. Now, if you open this book up, you will see, well, I mean, let's turn to the title page first, that it really is a history of a theater published in the 20s.
Oh, neat.
And written by the theater manager. You know, that's okay. That's interesting. A. Milne has a little essay. It's got lots of gossip and celebrity style. But what really is interesting is it was written, inscribed Christmas of that year by the author Nigel Playfair to Mrs. Patrick Campbell.
Oh.
And that's important because Mrs. Patrick Campbell was George Bernard Shaw's muse, and great love in his life. Apologies to his wife, but he actually ended up writing a whole series of love letters to Mrs. Patrick Campbell, basically saying he was his, you know, his stars, his son, his all that Shakespearean language. And she was the first to play the role of Eliza Doolittle, which we're about to go see in My Fair Lady here in just a few minutes. Now, they haven't seen it, so we can't give you a reaction. But what's interesting is she was older at the time. She played it, and she was relatively old and much older than the actor who played Henry Higgins. So it's a complete reversal of what we think of today with the young Eliza. But Mrs. Patrick Campbell, and then later in life, just to make a few connections to some other by-day celebrities, she's quite famous for having turned down a number of very important starring roles. And the great critic Alexander Woollcott, if you remember our Noel Coward Acky Wacky episode of By Day, said she was like a Navy ship firing on the people trying to save her, and had all sorts of other
Quite an
things.
image.
Quite an image. And basically she was prevented by Shaw during his lifetime to publish the love letters because Shaw thought it would be a scandal, and it was going to be a scandal. And they were all published after Shaw's death, but a rather remarkable, never consummated affair, but an inspirational affair. And she was not only the star of Pygmalion, but the star and inspiration for most of Shaw's early writing. So pretty cool. And then this guy, Richard Luckert, had one of the cushiest jobs ever. He was the head of the Pepys Library in Cambridge, England, and which is a 17th century library, which also has the diaries of Samuel Pepys. And so he must have just somehow come across this book and then done it. The other nice thing about the book is wherever Shaw is mentioned, there are usually exclamation points like in the margin. So she's underlined "roars, Mr. Shaw," and this is Shaw talking about how great he is. So I'm pretty sure that is Mrs. Patrick Campbell's commentary there. There's another mention of Shaw here. She's got that marked, and then there's even comments like this, which they're talking about a play, and she says, "I was there." So it's an extra annotated version, signed copy, which I think the library sale thought it was. This came from a Canadian library sale. I thought it was signed, just by Playfair. I don't think they realized who Mrs. Patrick Campbell was, which is pretty
Wow.
And we're going to end with a funny book. We end with a funny book. At Stratford, Cathy, they have a bookshop which has hundreds of, I think, every book you can imagine on Shakespeare. And yes, this book was not there. And it wasn't there because, well, this was even too radical for the Stratford Festival. It is Macbeth, #killing it, a history of a translation of Harrisburg in emojis and text messages, which appeals to the young people today. They also, we don't have a copy of the Romeo and Juliet, but that one looked good. Just to give you a sense, instead of, is that a dagger I see before me? You get a memo talking about the googly eyes and the floating knife, and then a message pops up on the screen that says "Time to kill Duncan." it's pretty good. It's the entire story, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. The witch is here first for Macbeth, #killing it. I think the Shakespeare we saw was very accessible, but if you wanted to make it even more accessible, there's Macbeth, #killing it. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you'll watch next Friday and every Friday. We're heading back to the USA Today after My Fair Lady. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Jerry.
Thank you.
That was a lot of fun. We'll see you next Friday at noon and every Friday at noon for more adventures in the world of books.